After I broke down in his office for about 45 minutes, the doctor said to me, "Your problem is that you've got responsibility without control, and that's a clinical definition of stress."
David, thank you for joining me here today on the Go at Manav. For those that do not know you, could you please tell them a bit more about yourself?
Hi, yes, well, thanks for having me. My name's David Meikle. I am a marketing consultant and intermediary, which means that I spend a lot of my time helping brands and advertisers find the right advertising agencies for their needs. But I also am a business author, and I run training programs for marketers and for advertising agencies.
Great stuff, David. I'm looking forward to learning more about you as we go through this podcast journey episode together. But first, as guests of mine or people who watch my podcast know, is that I love to go back in time to learn a bit more about my guests. So in that case, with you, David, just taking you back a while away, what were you doing at age 18?
But that's going back some time. So the age of 18, I had finished my A-levels, and I was kidding myself that I was going to go to university. So I'd pretended to take a year out. I was pretending to myself at that time, and I started working. Basically, worked in a wine bar for quite some time. Became a bar manager, and then was poached to work in some factory production, which was pretty grim. And then found myself back in a bar, sort of having not gone to university, about age 21, and thinking probably not going to make a career out of this. So yeah, that's when things started to change.
It's interesting because when I was learning more about you, David, when we caught up, is that you went from, I didn't know that you actually worked in a wine bar and doing all of this. So how did you go from working in a wine bar to then doing advertising?
It was a great bar called it was called Van Catra in Leicester, and it was quite a kind of a stylish place. And many advertising agencies would frequent that bar, and I befriended a number of people who came in. And quite literally, I was talking to somebody who was a creative director at one of the agencies about what I should do with my life, and he said, "Well, you talk a lot of shit. You should work in advertising." And as they say, the rest is history. Boom, boom. So I kind of took that note and I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. It's not something I'd thought of. I looked into it. I started off in advertising sales, as one often does. And then I worked in a design agency and then a couple of regional agencies. Did a marketing job at the Meadowhall Centre for about a year and a half, which was awful. And then I met a headhunter in London who asked me how I was. And I said, well, I was miserable working in this marketing job. And she said, do you miss the people? And suddenly I realised that actually what I really liked about working in advertising agencies was the people that you mix with. So she set about finding me an opportunity, and yeah, then I ended up working at Grey Advertising in 1995. That was the big opportunity, really.
Wow. And this was just through meeting one person who completely changed the outlook you had in your life when you went from, you could have worked in a wine bar, but you chose, no, I wanted to do something a bit more different. It's interesting that you could have met someone else who had a different perspective and may have recommended another job that suited your personality. And it didn't mean that it was like within advertising. Do you think about it? You know, it's like, wow, because I met this one person, it shaped a lot of my career, I'd say. Yeah.
I do. I think that one of the interesting things is that you've got to listen,
Yeah.
because a comment like that could have just passed me by. And that's happened to me on more than one occasion. But there are moments when people will say things to you, and they might say them offhand, or they might say them and you may not really take them away and think about them. But there are moments that can be literally life changing, and that was for me. I don't know if I would have ended up in advertising. There were other people talking about other things to me, but this one really kind of appealed, and I kind of went for it. And I was young and I had no ties, I had nothing to stop me. So it kind of
It
worked
worked in
out.
your favor. Yeah, it worked out. So you worked in different agencies and talking about grade, what was that like for you?
So Grey Advertising was my initiation into the London scene, which was very, very different from anywhere that I'd worked before. Bigger budgets, bigger agencies, proper creative departments, much more brand focused. I was mostly doing kind of retail-y stuff in the provincial agencies, and then suddenly I was doing packaged goods, ad campaigns, and it was a completely different world, but one that I really enjoyed. I had a vertical learning curve. Nothing makes me happier than just learning constantly and absorbing new experience and information. So it really suited me. And it was an environment in which if you work hard and you perform well, you can go well. So, there was nothing holding me back. I was on quite a fast track. I joined as an account manager in 95 and I left as a board director 5 years later at the age of 30. And that's kind of normal indicator of a pretty fast track in the advertising business. So I was happy and I made a lot of friends, many of whom I still have today.
How did you stand out? You said you progressed really fast. Why is it a case you feel that some people can progress quicker than others?
That's a really interesting question. I think a lot of it is about fear. I think there's a lot of fear about taking initiative, doing what you think is right, asking difficult questions, putting yourself forward. So I was always looking for opportunities to do more stuff and learn more. So, for example, can I run the graduate recruitment program? It's the sort of thing that I would put myself up for and say I'd really like to do that. I think one of the main reasons was that I had a very different relationship with the creative department than many other people who were what were then affectionately known as suits, insofar as I really cared about the work and really got involved in the work and tried to understand the work far more than many others. Some people in account management would just take a point of view of a client and deliver it to the creative department, and then take the point of view of the creative department and deliver it to the client without really intervening in the process. They're just being a ping pong ball or a messenger between the two. And I was much more involved in understanding how advertising worked and what the real thinking was behind creative ideas and executions, so that I could sell work better. And as I sold work better, you progress a lot faster.
Yeah, that's true. It's interesting because I work in PR, so very different to, I guess, what you guys do in advertising.
Mm.
But I was actually just going to say that clearly you being a board director at 30 meant that your life was probably set. But I guess at that moment, you probably wondered what's next for you. So when did you realize then you wanted to change career paths and eventually start your own business?
It was interesting. I'd reached the limit of what I could learn in that agency, but what I didn't realize is how much more there was.
Okay.
So I went from Grey to Ogilvy and Mather in 2000, where I was responsible for running the BP retail business across Europe and launching their new BP Connect retail offer, which was an incredibly challenging and difficult job. But I had no idea that jobs like that had existed in the advertising business. So again, my learning curve had plateaued at Grey, and then it went straight back into vertical when I got to Ogilvy. So I did 3 years there, 18 months on BP, and then GlaxoSmithKline and Central Office of Information and a couple of other pieces of business. And then I got a call from a guy called Leonid Shutov, who, as his name might suggest, wasn't from the UK. He was the owner of an Ogilvy franchise in Moscow, and he was looking for a client services director. And at that stage, I was a board director, but I'd never been a head of department. I hadn't been head of account management. I hadn't been a client services director. There were various spots. I interviewed with him and went out and had a look, and I met the managing director. And at that stage, I declined, but in October, he rang again and said, maybe that wasn't right for you. What about running the show? And that was a whole different prospect. He'd seen something in me and he had a need. At that stage, Ogilvy and I in London had parted company. So I was quite happy to go back to an organisation that I knew, but in a very different role as what was then managing director and became head of country for Ogilvy across all disciplines during the brick boom of the early noughties, when people were investing heavily in Russia. Obviously, the international relationships were far better, in fact, close to what normal international relationships are with any other country. So, yeah, it was only after that that I took a complete pivot, because I left there after I did 4 years in Moscow. I met my wife there. We came back at the end of 2007, just in time for a global financial crisis, which was not the best time to be looking for your next senior role in an advertising agency. And that's when I took some time out and had to think about what I wanted to do. And that's when my career changed into its sort of second form, which was as a consultancy in what became the How to Buy a Gorilla company.
Wow. I mean, talking about the fact that you turned down a role to then get offered a more senior role, did you feel like it was also partly because you said no to the initial role? I mean, were you very tempted to take the initial role? It's nice that you actually got the chance to work abroad and then you came back at a very interesting time.
So I don't think I got the role as managing director of Ogilvy Russia because I turned down the client services director role. I think that there was some happy circumstance whereby that role became available to me and it appealed greater. So at that stage, my circumstances had changed, and kind of the stars aligned a little bit, if that doesn't sound a bit too cliche. And that's why I kind of went for it. What was interesting, I spoke to a friend of mine because I had another opportunity on the table to run a design agency in London, good and successful design agency. And I'd had a number of interviews with them and they were really keen on progressing. I had these two opportunities and I spoke to a friend of mine. He said, so how do you feel about the Russia opportunity? I said, filled with fear. And he laughed out loud and he said, that's an acronym. It stands for false expectations appearing real. Again, that was one of those moments that you kind of think, I need to think about things that scare me in a different kind of way, because you're pre-programmed to avoid risk, and that's what fear is that a risk alert. And it was one of the best decisions I ever took was to kind of laugh in the face of fear, as they say, and I just went for it. I had nothing to lose. I only had a mortgage on my flat in London. That was the only thing keeping me in the UK at the time, so it was a great opportunity to go.
How do you deal with fear in a modern day career perspective?
Interesting. I think fear in a modern day environment is kind of akin to stress, where it's an expression of stress, isn't it? So, one of these other kind of moments in my life where some very small thing that somebody said changed everything for me was when I was working at Ogilvy in London and had a massive mental health crisis. Felt like I was having a permanent panic attack with a massive weight on my chest day and night. I mean, it would go when I was asleep and it would go if I drank heavily, but those aren't really great coping strategies for a career. So I tried everything. I gave up everything that I needed to give up. I took up everything that I should. I gave up caffeine, took up more exercise and so on, and nothing worked. And finally I saw a doctor, and the doctor said to me, after I broke down in his office for about 45 minutes, the doctor said to me, your problem is that you've got responsibility without control. And that's a clinical definition of stress. And now, since that moment, that moment has changed everything for me, because so much of my work now is focused on responsibility and control, and I've even developed a business model based on that. But when you think about fear, what you're anticipating is exactly that dynamic. You're anticipating that you're going to be in a situation where you're out of control, but you have a responsibility either for yourself, others, or for an objective, and your fear is as a result of those two not matching. I don't think I'm going to be able to fulfill this responsibility with the control that I believe that I have. So now, so to answer your question, and this is a circuitous route to answering it. So now if I feel fear, I stop and think about, what have I got in my control? How much of the responsibility do I perceive is actually mine? What are the consequences of failure? And you can kind of start to break it down, or you can see how you can mitigate that kind of risk. And as you mitigate risk, you mitigate fear.
Yeah.
And you can realize, actually, there's lots that could go right as much as there's stuff that could go wrong. What's the worst that can happen often helps when you think about fear. Ultimately, I think it's about backing yourself in believing that you're going to get through. I've got through a hell of a lot, and it's largely by thinking that way. Since that minute in the doctor's office, I've managed my life a lot more productively as a result of balancing responsibility and control that way.
The way you're talking about fear, you spoke about it in a perspective now as an entrepreneur, but obviously before you were fearing more as an employee, as a client handler working in advertising.
Yeah.
When did this breakdown happen? How old were you, or when did it take place?
Between a corporate career and an entrepreneurial one.
Oh wow.
Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that transition happened a little by design and a little by default. So when I returned to the UK, no one was hiring senior admin because we were in a global financial crisis.
Yeah.
At the same time, I hadn't up until that point thought that I was ready to work for myself. I was hesitant at first, but then I found a couple of other people who were also in a similar situation, and we started a partnership company, initially called Salt, which was just sort of symbolic of value. Therefore, we were kind of value hunters in the marketing sphere. One specialised in production, one specialised in media, and I specialised in creative. But I set myself the task of trying to unpick one of the biggest problems in advertising and marketing, which includes, it includes PR, it includes every branch of marketing discipline, and that is that there is a dysfunctional relationship oftentimes between marketers, who are the beneficiary of marketing budgets, procurement or finance, who are the self-appointed finance police around marketing budgets, and agencies who are trying to maximize the return on investment of the money from marketing. And that kind of creates what I've trademarked, not really, but what I've coined as the triangle of doom.
Yeah.
because there's often a dysfunction between those relationships without clear set shared objectives, and without shared objectives, without shared interest, there isn't an environment of trust. So into that environment of distrust, people are investing tens of billions of trillions of dollars globally in order to get a return greater than the principal. And I kind of thought, well, okay, now's an opportunity to have a look at that and unpick it. And that's what turned into the thinking that turned into my first book, which was called How to Buy a Gorilla, and after which I then renamed the company. My first two partners having fallen away by then.
Tell us more about how to buy a gorilla.
It was interesting. I was having a conversation with Debbie Morrison at ISBAR, which is the Incorporated Society of British Advertisers, and she was their agency consultant. So she would run pitches for ISBAR clients, and I hadn't got into the pitch business by then, but she made an observation about the Cadbury Gorilla ad, which was this famous ad where a gorilla plays the drums as a metaphor for the feeling that you get when you eat a Cadbury's dairy milk.
Oh, interesting.
And she said that on the new business circuit, all clients want to do, all they say, we want to buy a gorilla. We want to buy a gorilla. And my observation to her was most clients aren't set up to be able to buy a gorilla, either in their financial relationships or in their management relationships with agencies. That it's not really easy for brands to buy exceptional creative work. And that's why so few do.
Yeah.
So what I then wanted to do was take that idea and unpick it. And I unpicked it such that it isn't just about everyone wanting to get great creative work, because sometimes brands, it'll sound strange, sometimes brands don't need great creative work. Sometimes brands don't want great creative work. Because if, for example, you're a portfolio business like Procter and Gamble, you can do great work on one shampoo product and you're stealing market share from another. And actually, you want something that's going to just be very specific and conservative in its ambition. So I wrote a book about how to match business strategy to marketing strategy to the relationships in the triangle of doom, and I called it How to Buy a Gorilla.
Damn. I feel like when I process things that are so complicated, I need things condensed into simple information. And the way how you're just describing this book just makes it so easy to just understand more about what goes on behind the scenes, and just more about the advertising aspect of how to buy a gorilla. So now my next question is, why are you so passionate about solving business challenges in agencies?
So now I have the opportunity to kind of bring together all sorts of different things. Firstly, I've got my own agency experience, so I've been in both an employee position and as a leader, where you understand the real pressures of not just being able to make great products for your clients, but also run a business, run a P&L, run a balance sheet, manage all of the other functions. I've kind of got that complexity and experience under my belt. But also, I think what was most interesting about the thinking that went into How to Buy a Gorilla is that when I started to unpick that problem, I didn't have a dog in the fight. I didn't care what the answer was going to be because I wasn't working for an agency and I wasn't working for a brand. I could just step back and look at what are the different value exchanges and what are the different interests between these parties when they're working together. And that really gave me the opportunity to see whether or not there was an answer or a framework through which people could get different answers that were better than the answers they were getting. And that's ultimately what How to Buy a Gorilla is, because there's 100 books that you can get about how to buy great creative work. But what you won't find are many books about what are the circumstances that you need to create to improve the chances of that happening. And also, what if you don't want that? I mean, you can't have a set of best practice guidelines for a client agency relationship if they'll only work for creating a gorilla. What if your client is Cash for Gold? What if your client is Ryanair? What if your client is Burberry? You're not going to be using the same practices. So I needed a framework that would apply to any kind of business problem. And that kind of made it more complex. It ended up taking a bit longer than I expected it to, but it was very well received. So that was very gratifying.
I'm glad to hear that it's paid off for you. Yeah, no, no, really, really good. I guess now I'm just curious, what sort of other business opportunities you've had? I mean, in terms of your own business, past, present, and what are you up to nowadays?
So my latest venture is still building on this idea of responsibility and control. From that, I developed a model called the Meikle matrix, which was basically it plots responsibility and control against a four-box matrix, and you can identify that if you have high responsibility and high control, you're going to perform better than if you have high responsibility and low control. And that's all fleshed out in my second book, which is called Tuning Up. But when I was developing Tuning Up, I wanted some sort of interactive experience of this model for people. And a friend of mine called Rob said I could do something for you online to help you launch the book. And we kind of got into developing this kind of short questionnaire whereby you could plot 5 different relationships to see what your levels of responsibility and control were, and then you would be diagnosed by which quadrant you fell into. And we just got to talking. And as the more we got to talking, the more it kind of grew arms and legs. And since, what was that, September? That must have been just over 2 years ago. And now what we have is a product called ProLibris. It's a means of boosting productivity in any organization by empowering everyone in that organization to understand their circumstances through the lenses of responsibility and control. Through a twice annual survey, they are asked a bunch of questions about who they are and their circumstances and which department they work in and what responsibilities they have, like clients or suppliers or whatever. Then they are asked a bunch of questions about responsibility and a bunch of questions about control, and then we can plot where they are. Now, rather than this being a staff survey that you then kind of gets sent into a black hole and nothing happens, what's different about this one is that the main beneficiary of it is the respondent. So when they finish this survey, they get an analysis back to them that says, when it comes to teamwork, this is how you are. Maybe you need to think about increasing your control or decreasing your responsibility or your sense of responsibility. When it comes to line management, when it comes to managing suppliers. So it's like an online coach that helps individuals in organizations perform better. And it helps management as well, because incidentally, you can anonymize all of that information and then show them patterns between departments and so on. So it's an incredibly powerful product. We've run it once this year in its first year with a very good reception. We're just looking at our second client to come on board in January.
Oh, that's amazing.
So yeah, very exciting times for that. But it's supported with a new book that I wrote called a Little Book About Balance, about balancing responsibility and control, so that everyone in the organization can start using the same language and be able to not negotiate, but be able to communicate with one another more effectively in order to make sure that everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be doing it, where they share responsibility, where they share control, and where they don't.
I'm just trying to process all of that in, David.
It's a lot.
It's great. I mean, I guess I'll say my second last question is, are you currently writing a new book based on everything you've just said?
Yeah, so this is the thing that keeps me awake at night, because everything I've written to date, well, the 2 main books that I've written to date, which are How to Buy Gorilla and Tuning Up, are about work in advertising and marketing.
Yeah.
But the insight about responsibility and control is universal. It applies to personal relationships, it applies to business relationships, it applies to business consumer relationships, it applies to intercompany relationships, any relationship at all. And that universality is bugging me because there's something bigger here that can help more organizations. So at some point, I'm going to have to do a version about the Meikle matrix and about responsibility and control, which is not just about advertising and marketing. And that's probably the next one. So in the meantime, I did a little book about balance, which is kind of something that anyone in the organization can read in 10 minutes to understand the principles of the Meikle matrix. But I've got in my mind that I probably need to write a big book about balance, which is going to be how you can apply the insights around this dynamic to any organization at any level or any relationship at home or in the family or wherever for a balanced and better and less stressed life.
And I look forward to hearing more about that.
Well, I've got to write it first.
In due course, or when the time comes, who knows, in the podcast in the future. Right there, we actually have now come to the last question after learning more about your career journey. Very interesting to hear how you obviously went from working in a wine bar to working in advertising, agency life, working abroad, coming back, starting your own agency, own business, writing a book, now 2 books. And throughout all of this, so what would you say to your 18-year-old self in that case, looking at how far you've come?
So, well, the obvious answer is to buy Apple stock and Google stock. The advice answer, the proper answer would be that no one's actually holding you back. If you really want to get on, if you really want to progress your career, There's nothing stopping you. I mean, now, back then when I was 18, there was no internet. There wasn't an unlimited source of information at your fingertips, but there were books. And I didn't really develop my appetite for reading business books and improving my outlook at work and improving my performance at work until I was in my very late 20s, which is appalling. I could have been, I could have read 100 books by then. But you look at the people who work in careers in advertising and marketing, so many of them haven't read one or two. And you kind of think, this is your life and your career. How difficult is it? Get off Instagram and get into a book, and you could run a program of reading a book a week or a book a month. Imagine that. If you read 12 books about advertising and you worked in the advertising business, you would be better read than most people who work in that business. 99% of the people, probably. If you're going to do it, my advice to my old self would have been, if you're going to do it, the helping hand is at the end of your arm. Pick it up, pick up a book.
Wise words, David. I feel like I need to pick up a book right after this.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. No, don't worry. I mean, the thing is that I used to read a bit more when I was younger, but when I read now, I'm like, because I read so much for PR. I mean, I read articles, I read
Of course.
texts, and so how much more can my brain process information than podcasting, reading online about my guests, like you yourself, David?
Sure.
So I'm like understanding, okay, this is what he does, this is what she does, this is what she, all I mean, my guests do, past, present, future. So I think it's now picking up a physical copy, or I guess
Kindle.
Kindle. Yeah, took me a second. Maybe that could be my New Year's resolution.
That's the way it works.
Yeah.
I always make New Year's resolutions. I find them terribly helpful. It's great to have an end date or a beginning date.
I did well in 2025 with my New Year resolution, so I do need to think more wisely and I guess more strategically and see if I can actually achieve what I set to. Anyways, thank you so much, David, for joining me here today.
That was fun.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, I
mean,
it was a blast in the past for you. For people who'd like to get in touch and learn more about you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
You can email me at david@htbag, which stands for how to buy a gorilla.co.uk, or you can contact me through my website, htbag.co.uk, or you'll find me on LinkedIn. My surname is Meikle, David Meikle. Yeah, it'd be nice to hear from anybody who's interested in the things I've been talking about.
David Meikle, that's it for you guys. Thank you so much, David, for joining me here today. And for those watching, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. A new guest will be on soon. And yeah, thanks, David. And
thanks very much.